So it's very easy to introduce Marco Zappacosta because he has a very short bio. He left Columbia University and started Thumbtack. But what appealed to me when I read your bio, Marco, was you really have a profound understanding of the nexus between the macro, the tens of millions of professionals out there in the marketplace for you and for platform businesses, and the individual experience both on the platform and benefiting from the platform. You really have that sense of that, and that's very much how those of us working with entrepreneurs, where we are too. So I also wanted to shout out the partnership between Thumbtack and Youth Business USA, which is very unique, and really want to give credit to you for seeing that there's a whole marketplace of underserved professionals that aren't reaching Thumbtack, and that Youth Business USA, Bo, you want to raise your hand, who provided us with both Victor and Brianna, two of our wonderful entrepreneurs this morning, is working with Thumbtack to train entrepreneurs on how to optimally use the Thumbtack platform and create the profiles. And this is something they need to do in their business overall. So thank you for taking the chance of working with Cameo and Youth Business USA, and we know that it's going to pay off big time. So Marco, take it away.
Thank you to Claudia and to Cameo for having me. This is actually the first time I'm doing this exact presentation, and it's something that we are very passionate about at Thumbtack. So for a tiny bit of context, who we are. So Thumbtack is a marketplace that connects customers with local service professionals all around the country. Think carpenters, caterers, cleaners, any and all folks who come to you to perform a professional service. We've been at it since 2009. We now have over 200,000 active paying businesses on the platform. We send them over $1 billion a year and have learned a lot about the experience of being a local service professional. So you heard stories from Victor and others earlier today, and they shared the sort of their awesome experiences. And now I'm going to pull back up and talk about the sort of landscape more broadly and what we think people need to keep in mind when discussing the future of work. So really we're going to talk about two things. First, the state of the world as it is today. I tried hard to present just facts here, should be non-controversial, and I think this is an important starting ground for understanding what's happening. And then the second part, we're going to share our view, and this is from our own experience and what we see and what we think is going to happen. So let's start, because it's always nicer that way, with the good news. And there is, in fact, good news in the future of work. First off, we have grown out of the Great Recession. It bears repeating that in 2008, 2009, we had the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. We have now grown, and we're almost 10%, a little more than that, larger than we were at the previous peak. So thankfully, we are out of that. And even more importantly, job recovery has happened. We've historically talked about jobless recoveries. We are now in the longest streak of consecutive job growth on record over the last 8 years. That's something to celebrate. And the employment rate below 5% now is half what it was at the nadir of the crisis. And I actually think the single most important thing that has happened over the last few years is that non-managerial wage growth has picked back up. Wages, particularly for those in the middle class, for decades had stagnated. And you can see this chart starts in the 1980s and even a decade before that. But over the last couple years, since the end of 2012, wage growth has gone up much more than in any previous period. This is great. This means that the gains of economic growth and prosperity are not just going to the owners of capital, but are going to the laborers as well. This is very, very important. But it is not all good news, I hate to report. First off, income inequality is widening. By really any measure, this measure uses the Gini coefficient. We now are at income inequality levels not seen since the 20s in this country. That is a fact of life that we now live in. And not just sort of if you look at by income cohorts, but if you look geographically, there has been a dispersion of where the economic gains have gone. There are many portions, particularly of the South and Midwest, areas that were predominantly sort of industrial, that are still economically distressed, that in many ways have not recovered since the Great Depression. And there's no question that the economies that are part of the sort of knowledge work are booming, but those that are not are being left behind. We also are seeing Americans exit the workforce. Despite us having a very low unemployment rate, we have actually not recovered the prime age working ratio that we had previous to the recession. This means that for good reasons, maybe retirees who decide to opt out of the workforce, but also bad reasons, people who don't believe there's a job worth going back to, not as many Americans are in the job force as there were before the Great Recession. And this is something that gets talked about a lot. Automation is a very real phenomenon that is going to have profound effects on the US economy. I put up a big range here, from 9% to 47% of total US employment is considered at risk of automation. That lower bound number is from one set of economists, that higher bound is from another set. I don't know where it is, but even if you take that lower bound, that 9%, you're talking about almost 20 million Americans. 20 million Americans whose livelihood is going to disappear. The job that they've used to earn them and maybe their family's income will no longer be there for them. That is something that we're going to have to deal with. And it gets talked a lot about Silicon Valley, and thankfully it's now being something we're talking about more broadly, but this is no doubt something that we will face. Also, economic mobility is declining. So historically, if you go back to the 70s and 40s at the start of this graph, almost 90% of children could expect to be better off than their parents at age 30. That's a sign of a prosperous society, that the children of succeeding generations do better and better. Sadly, we are now in a position where only 50% of children can expect to be in a better position than their parents at age 30. That is a challenge, and that is something that we are going to have to reckon with. So this is the question that we think about. This is something that we think should animate the debate. How can we generate inclusive and sustainable economic growth? Right? That's the point of prosperity. And before I sort of posit our view and our answer, I'd like to say a few things that we believe it is not going to be. This is what we think will not provide that. First and foremost, manufacturing. So surprisingly, the United States has never manufactured more goods than it ever has today than any ever before. However, we're doing it with fewer laborers. There is nothing that we see happening that's going to change this. Much like agriculture now only employs a few percent of the United States population, manufacturing is on an inexorable downward trend as a percent of employment. You also can't expect people to move, not just because it's infeasible to ask tens of millions of Americans to uproot their families and move, but economic mobility is going down. People are less likely to move from where they grew up. I think the measure is always cited as the people who live within 50 miles of where they're born or where their mothers live. Increasingly, we tend to stick around our moms, good and bad. But we certainly can't expect people to move. Unions. Unions will not be able to battle this trend for the very simple reason that union membership is on the decline. And when you look at the jobs most likely to experience growth, those are ones that are historically underrepresented by unions. Now, there could be a giant union movement that sort of incorporates all these folks. We view it as unlikely, and so we think that unions, while playing an important part today and certainly tomorrow, are not likely to represent the bulk of workers and therefore able to help solve this problem broadly. Another one, and this may be surprising some of the folks here, is on-demand labor platforms. So I'm sure all of us in this room have used a ride-sharing service of some type, a delivery service of some type. They are great customer experiences. However, what they are not is great sources of full-time, sort of middle-class incomes. And this is from their own data. So over 80% of all these platforms, I think even 85% on Uber, the drivers claim to be doing it as a supplementary source of income. And in that regard, it's great, be it students, retirees, folks who just need more money and want to hustle on the side, fantastic. This is not anything but great, but we need to be honest that it's not going to provide the future of work. And actually even more so when you assume that these jobs are some of the most at risk of automation. You know, these companies are working hard to automate these jobs to begin with, so we certainly can't count on them sticking around. So, what do we think the answer is? And I wish I had a whiz-bangy, pithy answer, but I have a slightly wonky one, but I think for this room it will be okay. And that is non-routine, non-tradable jobs. Doesn't quite roll off the tongue, I will admit, but I think this is the best framework for understanding the future of jobs in America. Ones that are inclusive of all folks, irrespective of educational achievement, and things that we can count on for providing a genuine middle-class lifestyle. So what am I talking about? What are these jobs? They span a huge breadth of things. You know, you have florists, you have teachers, you have nurses, mechanics, social workers, photographers, personal trainers. For those that have used Thumbtack or have played with it, you will see that many of these services are on Thumbtack, but certainly not all. So while this trend is certainly something that we look to and we think about, it's much broader than just Thumbtack. Nurses and healthcare workers are not something that we have on Thumbtack. Teachers, social workers, not something we have Thumbtack, but we believe they are fundamental to the future of work. And let me back this claim up. So this is a graph that shows what has happened to employment, whether these jobs are non-routine manual, non-routine cognitive, or routine cognitive, routine manual. The takeaway is that the routine jobs are shrinking, the non-routine jobs are growing. Another important takeaway is that this isn't a reflection of whether a job is cognitively demanding. In fact, you have high prestige jobs who are at risk of automation. The single biggest job type that is at risk of automation over the coming 10 years is accountants and bookkeepers. That's traditionally and rightfully thought as a cognitive task, a cognitive service. Another task that is at risk of automation are things like radiologists. Super high prestige, super high training, and yet things that, because they're very routine, are very susceptible for software systems to automate. Now, on the flip side, there are a lot of non-routine manual jobs. Think of your plumber. That is a manual job. Sometimes a dirty one, but always an important one. But it's non-routine, right? Your furnace is broken in a way that's very specific to you and your furnace, different than mine and my heater. That's why it takes a real professional to show up, diagnose the problem, and solve it for you. And that's why we pay these folks a good amount. So that's the non-routine aspect. It's also the non-tradable. That's really important. If a job can be done more efficiently or more cheaply overseas, you can assume it will end up overseas. That's not a normative statement. I'm not saying if it's good or bad. It's a factual statement. It will happen. The economic gravity is such that those jobs will be offshored. And so what does that leave? That's the non-routine, non-tradable jobs. That's what America has to work with. And it's not just me sort of making this up. If you look forward, and this is the Bureau of Labor Statistics, over the next 10 years, between now and 2024, 95% of jobs are going to be local service jobs. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about the future of work. And something that is really important to keep in mind is when you're thinking about these local service jobs, you have to think about entrepreneurship. These jobs, by and large, are created by new businesses. So new businesses in the economy-wide account for the bulk, or nearly all, of net new job creation. We have a dynamic economy. We grow by having new businesses show up, serve their customers in a new and compelling way, and through that, hire people and grow. It's extra true in local service jobs because those tend to be smaller companies which go out of business and go into business a bit more often. So this is what we believe is going to happen. The future of work is non-tradable, non-routine jobs, local services job. So the question then becomes, why should we be happy with this? Okay, yeah, it's going to happen, but is it good or bad? Our view is that it can be a great thing, and it should be a great thing if we all do our jobs and work hard to make it so. First off, for the very simple reason that workers love what they do when they're self-employed. So most workers today who work independently do so by choice. Those folks who work independently are much more likely to call their work engaging than folks in traditional employment. And on Thumbtack, as an example, 84% of our pros say they love what they do. Only a third of people nationally surveyed say that. I would posit that it's a good thing for society for people to love what they do. That's incredibly important. Similarly, they're also able to earn more. If you love it, that's fine, but if it doesn't pay for your food and doesn't help put your kid through school, then it doesn't matter. But this is where wages are going up and not down. And the reason is because they're custom services that can't be done offshore, and they're non-routine, so you can't build a software system to do it at no marginal cost. You have to employ a talented professional who has some skill to do a specific job for you. That, we believe, is not only the likely future of work, we think it can be a good one and a well-earning one for folks. And so here's when we get a little even more wonky than before. And I have this sort of graph. So historically, when we talk about the impact of technology on the economy, you get this sort of binary. Things get automated, prices go down for customers, which is great, but workers lose their jobs, which is bad. And then it's hard to figure out, is this on net a good or bad thing? Well, it's how much of the first thing versus the second thing. Hard to know. I would posit that this is actually not the only dynamic that is occurring. It's certainly one of the dynamics, but not the only one. And technology, as much as it can destroy jobs, it can also help create them. And so this is how we think about the world. When we innovate at Thumbtack, what we are trying to do is expand networks. Be the world's biggest matchmaker when it comes to busy moms and busy professionals and all the talented service professionals that they are trying to meet. We believe that these innovations can be truly win-win. You know, the nature of trade is positive sum. That's why the world has gotten richer over time, that it's not a zero-sum pie. We can grow the pie. And an example of that is by expanding networks, you give customers more options. That tends to lead to services that are more finely suited for their needs and what they want, as well as better prices because you have more people competing. In this scenario, you also have more entrepreneurship. There is more opportunity for the entrepreneurs of this country to seize that and to create something for themselves and through that, employees. This is a win-win for both customers and workers and something that we are a part of, but many technology companies are doing. So the one takeaway I hope is that technology is not necessarily good nor necessarily bad. It is a force for job destruction, which is, we should remember, how our world has gotten wealthier. We do less of the things that we used to have to do, and that is good. But if that's not coupled with more opportunity, then we are failing our fellow citizens and not providing them the means to support themselves and their families. So it's not good or bad, but done right, I think it can be very good. And it's happening a ton on Thumbtack. This is a gentleman, Elijah Bowie, who is in Ohio, and he is the quintessential, just tenacious entrepreneur. He had this dream of being a personal trainer and sort of growing a business of his own, but like many of these folks, didn't know how to find customers. If you think about it, being a great online marketer has nothing to do with being a great personal trainer. And yet today, to be successful, you need to have both skills. That makes no sense. The personal trainers of this country, the caterers, the tutors, all those folks have a talent. In this case, he's a great trainer, he's a great coach. He shouldn't have to worry about all the other factors that go into creating and running a business. He now not only has a full book of business, but he has employees that he's hired because we've done that work of finding him customers online. So technology can be net positive. Folks say, and this is a freelancer survey, so in some ways it's looking at this population, not looking at everybody, but 73% of independent workers believe that technology today is doing a better job of helping them find work more easily. I think that is only going to become more true in the future, not less so. Also, and this is sort of an aggregate statement and a very important one, and that is that technology on net creates more jobs than it destroys. And I hope that's not that controversial of a statement. If you simply look back 10, 20, 50 years, 100 years, there's no doubt that we've automated or destroyed the bulk of jobs that existed in 1900, or certainly maybe even before that. But yet we all, or most of us, are employed. We have a 4.7% unemployment rate. So technology in aggregate can create more jobs than it destroys. So, and this is when we get to the takeaways, what can we do, and what can we do as a group of folks who wants to see this positive future come about? Well, I think there's a role for us to play as technology companies, and that is to really expand networks, which is really about creating or surfacing the opportunity that exists in the world. I would posit that the biggest asset that this country has, it's not its physical infrastructure, it's not its institutions, it's the human capital that is latent in all of us and the workers all around this country. That is by far the most valuable resource we have. And yet, a lot of it is hard to access. You don't know who's talented in what. And customers often don't know how to find or don't know how to trust these folks to be able to benefit from their services. So as a technology industry and as a sort of policy industry more broadly, we have to focus on expanding these networks to reveal the latent talent and connect it with the opportunity that it deserves. And we're seeing that this is happening. This is a graph of a survey we do of our pros, which is to say, what do you need out of technology? The primary one is acquiring customers. But they also need help with taxes. They have concerns around healthcare costs. They have concerns around their own access to labor, competition from other businesses. We can't fix all these things, but we can certainly address some of their most pressing concerns with technology. And it's not just us. The folks from Intuit have helped sponsor today, and they do a lot, right? Automating that back office task of bookkeeping and tax prep is a huge boon to small businesses. None of them get into work for themselves so that they can do their own taxes. That's not the fun part, but it matters. There's folks from Stride Health here today who are helping give these independent workers access to benefits and tools to better take advantage of the platforms that they're on. And there's a lot more. This is just the start. I think a very exciting trend that has happened in Silicon Valley over the last, say, 5 years is that these companies are more and more not in the business of selling technology, right? We don't package up a piece of software in a box and sell it as software itself. We use technology to enable a service which solves a pain point in the world. These technology companies, for better or for worse, now have the ability to impact the world writ large. I think that's incredibly exciting. I am naturally an optimistic entrepreneur, so I tend to see the good and the exciting bit, but I really believe that in aggregate it will be great. So what can government do? Last slide was about technology companies. What about government? So we think there's 3 fundamental things that governments and policymakers should be focused on to enable this future of work to truly flourish. First off, it's benefits portability. We've talked a lot about that in light of healthcare and what Obamacare did for the portability of healthcare, but it's true much more broadly than that. Today, tax advantage retirement accounts primarily are administered through companies. You've got disability insurance. You've got workers' comp. A lot of the things that we as a society over the decades have said is vital to have for the workers of this country, but we are administering it in an old way. We are administering it through full-time employment, which in the 20s, 30s, 40s, when all this got developed, made a ton of sense because that's how the bulk of humans in this country were employed. But that's less and less true today, and radically less so in the future we see ahead. And so if we want to get out ahead of that and provide the same benefits, this statement is valid independent of whether you believe there should be more or fewer benefits. It's simply stating that once you have agreed on the benefits that are due to the workers in this country, we should administer it in such a way that they are given to individuals and not employees. The second thing, and this we hear from our pros over and over and over, is that the regulatory burden far outweighs the tax burden that they face. This isn't to say that regulation should disappear. Regulation serves a very important role to protect customers. That should stay. But we should be ever more cognizant of the cost of compliance that we impose on the small businesses of this country. If you're talking about GE, they have a compliance department. They can deal with the tax law changing every year. And in some ways, they benefit from it because they know they are already staffed up to do so. When you talk to a small catering company, they can't keep up with all the regulatory changes. And so what we hear from them is say, hey, just make the rules simple. Tell me what they are at any given time in a very easy to digest way, and give me training such that I can comply. These folks want to be in compliance. Nobody's trying to sort of skirt the law, but it's hard for them to do so, and therefore we need to streamline the regulatory system to their benefit. The last thing is we need to invest in training for the jobs of tomorrow. We need to recognize the types of jobs that are going to happen and give people trades and skills and talents that will enable them and their families to earn a sustainable wage for decades to come. So that is what we think people should focus on. And I hope to leave you with just a belief that the future of work is bright. And that if we collectively are able to realize its potential, I think it will be a much better world than one we've ever lived in. And as a closing story, I want to tell you about this gentleman, Jonathan. So I think Jonathan represents, he has lived this entire sort of debate and conversation. He's an accountant, or was, excuse me, an accountant in Connecticut for the YMCA. In the same week that he heard his wife was pregnant with their first child, he got laid off from his job because the YMCA had offshored his job. He is among that most at-risk population of accountants and bookkeepers. Throughout his time at the YMCA, he had developed a love for photography. He just had fun doing it. And when he got laid off, he decided to, instead of going to look for another accounting job, to pursue this passion that he had and to start a photo booth company. And this is him in his words. 5 years ago, I was just a guy with a camera, a tripod, and an idea. And Thumbtack was there to give me my first clients. Owning a business can be hard, but now here I am living out my own version of the American dream. I think the future of work is one where more and more folks get to live their own versions of the American dream. And I think that's incredibly exciting and something we're passionate about working towards. So, thank you very much.
Do we have a time for maybe a couple of questions for Marco?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's...
You want to shout it out or? Yeah.
Thank you. That's a great presentation. My question actually is on the third point about what government can do, and this has to do with this challenge that I've been thinking about a fair amount, and that is if you are on a platform economy job, or if job may not be the right word, but if that's what you're doing, if that's how you're earning your living, how do you develop skills? So where is the platform? So with the example of the gentleman who was a lawyer, so obviously there are CLE programs that he could kind of think about doing or helping to improve his skills, but really the value that we have is the accumulation of the skills over the course of our lives and how we're able to adapt them. And many times those skills are acquired in a more formal setting rather than informal. Now, I do understand there are Khan academies and different ways about getting skills than we would have thought of in the past, but this is a potential weakness that I see with this particular economic approach. It's one that I think should be overcome, and I definitely believe that the workforce development community should be better aligned to address people who find themselves who are desiring to participate in this economy. But I am curious about what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so I think it's a great question, and I think I summed it up in a tiny bullet that says we need to be better about training the workforce of tomorrow. There's a lot that goes into that, and I certainly think there's a big role for government to play, but I think there's also a role for platforms like us to play. A very simple thing that we are about to roll out is show folks where there's opportunity. Very simple example. If you are a yoga instructor, you should not move to San Francisco. We have a lot of yoga instructors here. You should move to Memphis. We, because of the platform position we have, see this variability and can highlight it to folks so that they make sure they go somewhere where their skill is one that is needed. Additionally, I think you're going to see us ever more work to help our professionals find apprenticeship. I think there's certainly a role for formal education, and that's a big part of learning how to apply these trades. But if you look at Hollywood, which is, in fact, a gig economy, movies and TV shows sort of spin up and then spin down. The way that people progress in their careers is not that they have a sponsor who employs them on a full-time basis, but that they grow and they apprentice. They need a way in, and they need someone to mentor them and support them, but they acquire skills on the job. I'd love to believe that platforms like us can do ever more of that in the future. As the limiting factor becomes our professionals and their ability to attract talented workers, we're going to build tools to help them do that. And through that, to make it clear to customers, hey, you're hiring an apprentice worker, you get a reduced rate, and he still or she comes with our sort of guarantee. I think there's a lot that platform companies can do, but you're totally right that it's going to be a big challenge, maybe even the biggest challenge of all, making sure we have the right skills in the economy.
Actually, I'd like to just add on to that. Todd works with the Federal Reserve in Atlanta, and this is his sort of area of expertise. He's very supportive in this. So I think, Todd, you and your peers need to bring that message to the Federal Reserve Board, to the Treasury Department, particularly in the new administration, because this is an opportunity lost. And, there's nobody here from Workforce Today. There's almost no government people involved with, economic development here today. I think that speaks to some issues that we need to address, and this afternoon we'll do that. Thanks.
Yep.
Oh, Pamela.
I'm interested in how Thumbtack works with the required contracting licensing that many things like plumbers and painters and are required that can be expensive. I agree it needs to be streamlined, but it also can be very difficult to attain your contractor's license due to the educational requirements and experience and things like that. And there's so many people out there doing handyman work, but are on the edge of being contractor. And just how do you see that unfolding?
Yeah, so when we started being naive early 20-year-olds, we're like, oh, obviously there's going to be a government database that lists all of the required licenses to operate for any given industry in any given geography. We were very wrong. It is crazy to me that today, even as a customer, independent of me as a platform, it is not obvious what licenses are required to do what job. So in California, if it's less than $600, you don't need an electrician's or general contracting license. You can do it simply as a handyman, simply as sort of a talented tradesperson. where are we supposed to know these things? So I think the government has an obligation to help clarify what are the rules. And then I think for us, it's about making sure that the customer has full information, such that they know, hey, what is required? What does this person have? If they don't have everything, you can ask them and they can sort of supplant that information. We see ourselves as a matchmaker. We try not to dictate when and how people should operate or who exactly they should choose. We simply reveal the options that we have. And not surprisingly, for big ticket jobs, customers want licensed and insured pros. It's a big ticket job. There's a lot at risk. For the small ticket job, you just want, as it's called in the industry, chuck in a truck. You want that talented professional who comes out, does the job great, and goes back. That variability needs to sort of remain, but it needs to be much easier to understand what the rules are and to help both sides comply accordingly. Well, thank you again.